Just a short welcome from me to the School of Education seminar. Part of the reason why we're hosting this seminar is because there has been a wider call need for the further engagement with the idea of academic freedom. And we know that this is supported by even UCT's Academic Freedom Committee, that actually we need to have a robust debate about what this means in this moment. I will introduce the chair for this evening. Saleem Badat is Professor of Education Policy and the current Director of the School of Education here. He's an education policy sociologist who teaches and researches in areas tied to education policy, sociology of education, history of education, technical and vocational education, and conceptualizations of conflict and violence in relation to education globally and in South Africa as well. Saleem served on the UCT Academic Freedom Committee from January in 2020 till the 30th of June 2024, and he also served as the chairperson for the last 2 years of that. Saleem, please.
Welcome everyone to this talk, both from UCT and outside the university itself. Our topic today, of course, is academic freedom and social justice. The academic freedom today faces unprecedented threat with very grave consequences. Across universities, we've witnessed the silencing, disciplining, and dismissal of academic staff and students, incursions into pedagogy and curricula, restrictions on student admissions, and overt attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion. These assaults are driven by governments, funders, administrators, and faculties aligned to mostly right-wing ideologies. Institutional autonomy is also imperilled as universities increasingly capitulate to political and financial pressures. The pressing question for us is, how do we as public universities in post-apartheid South Africa navigate these challenges while holding fast to a broad and principled commitment to social justice? So what we are going to do today is I'll first introduce our first speaker, Yusuf Gabru. Yusuf Gabru is an ex-mathematics teacher. He was an ANC member of the Western Cape Provincial Legislature. He was also it was a brief time, the representative of the Department of Basic Education at UNESCO. He's also a key participant within the UCT Alumni for Palestine. But Yusuf is far more than that, and I'm not going to say more than that. I think our audience do know who you are. Yusuf.
Thank you very much, Azi. Comrades, friends, I'm not sure what your association is with or how you relate to Al Jazeera. What's happened to me is that in the beginning, I had to keep watching it every night. And after a while, I just couldn't watch it anymore. And so then I had to stop watching it. And so what happens now is that I don't watch it, and then I kind of almost feel guilty because I'm not watching it. It's as if I'm doing something wrong by not keeping up to date with it. So we turned it on again last night, and we really should not have done it, because they showed the picture of the pregnant woman that was killed. And of course, the baby died as well. So that was the smallest corpse that I had seen all the time. And needless to say, I really couldn't sleep after that. I'm raising this issue now because I'm going to refer to it a few times. What I don't understand is how people can see all of this every day, yet continue to support the state of Israel. To me, it's something that's just mind-blowing. I can't figure that out. I've thought about it over and over again, and I can't work out how anybody can relate to this massacre, this genocide, in a different way than I'm relating to it. And basically, that's the issue that I want to talk about this evening. So the other thing I wanted to say is we should today also remember the flotilla that's going to Gaza, those very brave comrades of ours who are going to try to break the blockade. And I'm not sure where they are at the moment. The first report I read said that they had to turn back because of the wind or something, the weather conditions. But I'm not sure. But I just thought that we should mention them and we should really salute them and think about them. So comrades, on behalf of the UCT Alumni for Palestine and the UCT School of Education, we want to welcome you to this really important gathering. And we want to thank the school for hosting it. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which this university stands and where we are holding this session now was donated to this university by Cecil John Rhodes. He donated it to the University of Cape Town. But of course, like most of the land in the Western Cape, it was stolen land. It wasn't his land to give. But that's what he nevertheless did. And UCT was grateful to accept stolen land. Much of what this university is rests on inherited colonial blunder. Colonialism and apartheid are woven into the fabric of UCT, even though it long styled itself as an English liberal university. So things changed a bit after '94, when UCT positioned itself as a transforming space. And then after Rhodes Must Fall, in 2015, it declared its commitment to decoloniality and building a just society. I'm sure that as alumni, we all supported that transformation, but at the same time recognized that there were some very powerful forces on this university who resented that change. So the passing of the Gaza resolutions, and I'm sure you all know what the resolutions are, was a landmark because it was passed by the Senate, the Council, and the AGM of Convocation in 2024. And it marked a moment of profound solidarity with the people of Palestine who have been facing a relentless genocide, ecocide, the mass starvation imposed by colonial apartheid regime. I'm not sure if you've seen the latest figures, but just in the short space, the number of young children who have died because of this starvation. Predictably, those who are opposed to the transformation at UCT are the ones who support Israel and Gaza. It's the same people. They sought to undermine the resolutions. They used financial and legal pressure. They mobilized that to try and to fight against the Gaza resolutions. But when I made a point in the beginning about not understanding people who are not moved by the genocide, these are the same people I'm talking about. I still can't understand how a professor of history at this university, not an ordinary professor, not like me who studied mathematics, I know nothing about history. A professor of history would understand everything about the Holocaust, who's obviously understood the genocide very well. He is taking his own university court to rescind a motion that expresses solidarity with Palestinians and are calling for an end to the genocide. If anyone, I would really like somebody to explain that to me. Who are these people? Where do they come from? Where do they live? What do they talk about every day when they go home? These resolutions, it's not just Professor Mendelssohn, but there's a lot of liberal and Zionist staff, alumni, members of council and Senate who have applied relentless pressure on UCT to rescind the motions. And today, those motions are more important than the days that they were passed. It is the Senate and the Council. No person with a shred of humanity, decency, or morality could question the relevance of these motions. Our response to the attack on the Gaza resolutions and the intimidation of the progressive staff, I'm not sure, it's a pity that we don't have all the details, but maybe in the discussion, some of the university staff and tell us about the intimidation that had taken place at this university. All of this in the context of arguing that the resolutions oppose academic freedom. But nevertheless, the response of some of the alumni at this university was to poem the UCT alumni for Palestine, as you know. We did this in September last year, and since then our membership has grown to more than 500. We've met with the Vice-Chancellor on 2 occasions. We were the ones who moved the support for the Gaza motion at the AGM of convocation. And I hope all of you have seen our open letter to the university, which has now garnered more than 1,600 signatures. In our meetings with the Vice-Chancellor, while from the one hand, he said that he acknowledged broad alignment with the principles of the resolutions, he failed to offer any clear and public support for them. The Vice-Chancellor at this university has not made a public statement of support for the resolutions. And that's also something that's really quite astounding. A university like Cape Town, 30 years into liberation, and the university principal can't make a statement. He failed to offer a clear public support for the thing. But the donors that support Israel and the assault on Gaza, they are very clear. They've got no doubt about their positions. So the Donald Gordon Foundation, the Dell Foundation, the Wendy Ackerman Foundation, and the Harry Crossley Foundation have withdrawn funding. Now, the Donald Gordon Foundation, you may know that Donald Gordon made most of his money out of property. And he made his money during the apartheid years when there was the Group Areas Act. The Wendy Ackerman and Pick and Pay, you know, the same thing happened to them. The vast amounts of money that they made was during under apartheid, when there were a whole lot of regulations about black people not being able to open stores. They are now using this money which they made under apartheid to force this university to withdraw the Gaza resolutions. Can you understand that? Is that at all possible? And Professor Mendelsohn, as I've already said, you know, a history professor, and he's not on his own. He's got access to large amounts of money. If you look at his behavior in the court case, every time something happens, he gets a new affidavit, and he's just prolonging the whole process. So he's not the only person. He's backed by a whole lot of other people. But what is the reality in Gaza today? I've already spoken a little bit about it. But the United Nations Commission in June 2025 confirmed that 90% of the schools have been damaged, 57 university buildings were destroyed, 87,000 students have been affected, and comrades, nearly 200 faculty members have been killed. And in many cases, they were deliberately targeted. I'm sure you've seen the items on the news where senior medical lecturers and doctors have been murdered by the Israelis. To add insult to injury, part of Al-Azhar University was converted into a synagogue for Israeli troops. Despite the devastation, Gaza universities have tried to continue functioning. Education for them have become both a survival strategy and an act of resistance. I want to quote for you one of the lecturers. He says, "We taught under drones and bombardment, not because conditions were right, but because people refused to give up. Education in Gaza is not a luxury. It's a dignity, hope, and defiance." The international community has also, for a change, spoken up clearly. In July 2024, the International Court of Justice declared Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem illegal. 2 months later, the United Nations General Assembly demanded that Israel end the occupation within a year. So they should have ended that occupation now. Instead, and I'm not sure if you've seen those protest plans that are being developed in America to get rid of everybody out of Gaza and create some strange, weird-looking place. A United Nations, at that time, a United Nations Commission reminded the whole world that all states are under an obligation to act individually and collectively to bring the unlawful occupation to an end by building political, economic, and cultural pressure on the Israeli government. States must do all that is necessary and reasonable to ensure that the Israeli government brings its wrongful acts to an end as rapidly as possible. That's the United Nations giving a legal opinion. So this is not simply a Palestinian demand. It is a binding legal and moral imperative on the global community, on South Africa and on UCT. And at some stage, we must talk about our own country exporting coal to Israel. Still, what an utter disgrace. As one of the persons, as you know, is our president's brother. He benefits the most from export of coal. I haven't heard the president say anything about his brothers. Despite overwhelming evidence, all the evidence that we see, there are still defenders of Israel. Let me just quote you what Daniel Bloch of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies said after there was a protest in Cape Town. He claimed that accusations of genocide are false and inflammatory, and he based this on the fact that the ICJ has not made a ruling. So because there's no ruling, there's no genocide. There have been others, and you may have seen the interview with Mampela on SABC the other day, where the interviewer was basically suggesting because not so many people have been killed, it's not a genocide. When we came to the convocation last year to the AGM, there was an online discussion. We were asking for convocation to support UCT and the resolutions. I don't know the lecturer, but there was a lecturer at this university who made the same point. It's not a genocide. Not so many people have been killed as there was in the Holocaust. So you can't call it a genocide. The whole world knows that the destruction of the education system in Gaza is not collateral damage, as most of them argue. It is a targeted attempt to eradicate the foundations of Palestinian higher education. Institutions that stand as a pillar of resilience, hope, and intellectual freedom under occupation and siege. Our responsibility as South Africa, as internationalists and as human beings, is to stand with the Palestinians unconditionally. I want to repeat that. We have to support the Palestinians unconditionally wherever we find ourselves. For UCT, this means not only defending, but fully implementing the Gaza resolutions. The academic boycott of institutions and individuals linked to the IDF, the very IDF that is instrumental in the genocide, is not radical. It's just the bare minimum that you can do. And the idea of calling for a boycott of individuals is very significant because it calls for a division. It makes a division between civilized people and uncivilized people. We are calling for a division between scholarship that affirms life or scholarship which advances destruction. So the person in our discussions with the Vice Chancellor, he was also very concerned about the division that was being created on UCT. And in point of fact, we have to have the division. We should not be running away from a division. I don't want to have any unity with the Zionists, not now, not in the past, and never in the future. So there's nothing wrong with a division. In fact, a division is the thing that we must argue for if we want society to progress. We all know neutrality in the face of oppression is complicity. Despite donor withdrawals and international pressure, we cannot retreat. The moral cost of silence is greater than the financial cost of lost funding. UCT's Gaza resolutions marked a milestone in the transformation journey, echoing its post-Rhodes Must Fall commitment to decoloniality and justice. Today, as Gaza's educators and students plead with us to not let our universities be erased, UCT's responsibility is clear. And it's not only a moral responsibility, as I've tried to point out. The ICJ and the United Nations have made clear that all states and institutions are legally and politically obligated to act. UCT cannot claim neutrality when the law itself demands action to an unlawful occupation. We must ensure that this institution remains firmly on the side of justice, in solidarity with Gaza's universities, in alignment with international law, and in defense of education as a right, an act of resistance, and a foundation for a just future. I want to thank you for your attention.
So I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Let me just outline the structure. It's going to be until 7 o'clock. So what we're going to do now is a curated conversation between Saleem and Anna, and then basically open to the floor and have a conversation with the rest of you. Saleem Badat is a research professor in the Department of History at the University of the Free State. He has served as director of the Education Policy Unit at UWC. He was the first CEO of the Council for Higher Education and ex-Vice Chancellor of Rhodes University and the Program Director of International Higher Education at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation in New York. Saleem is the author of 4 books, 4 edited collections, 60 papers, and over 50 media opinion pieces. Pertinent to today's discussion, in 2005, he convened the Council on Higher Education's independent task team on higher education, institutional autonomy, and academic freedom. Based on that, they produced in 2008 the report titled Academic Freedom, Institutional Autonomy, and Public Accountability in South African Higher Education. Anna Shomitzi is a political theorist working in the field of urban studies. She's a senior lecturer at the Center for Cities at UCT and convenes ACC's Masters in Southern Urbanism program, and is a member of the South African Jews for Free Palestine. So I'm going to open up the start of the conversation, and I'll allow the two of you just to have 3 hours of conversation.
Thank you so much, it's Kim. We'll do this standing up. Welcome everybody. Good evening. and welcome, Saleem. Thank you for doing this. It really is an honor for me to be standing here alongside you and to be prompting this conversation. So what I curated refers to the fact that Saleem and I have been in conversation in preparation to this so that we can make sure to cover all the issues that we wanted to fit in. And I wanted to start by just taking a moment to note what a privilege it is for us all to be gathering here in a university building that's intact. So just really to resonate what Yusuf was also mentioning and how lucky we are to be safe and strong enough to have this conversation. It really is a privilege these days in the face of what is happening. I wanted to start with the way I am entering this conversation is via another academic freedom talk that I rewatched in preparation to today, and that was Robin Kelly's talk, academic freedom talk last year, organized by the University of Johannesburg. And Robin Kelly there posed a question that for me guides this conversation or the way that I am posing these questions to you, Saleem. And if you don't mind, I'll just read a few lines from that. So Robin Kelly asked, what is our responsibility? What is the responsibility of intellectuals in the face of genocide? For those of us not drafting a legal brief, not in the International Criminal Court, should we really be wasting our time nitpicking over whether this is or not a genocide? We must fight for a complete end to the occupation. That is our responsibility. So I want to connect this then to the earlier conversation, and I know that many of you in the room have been at the book launch where Saleem was in conversation with Asame Benya and Connie Benson, and you were discussing activist research, and then Cooper also provoked you to reflect on revolutionary research. So to open on your part or from your part, would you like to reflect on why you think it's necessary, it's imperative, in fact, to have a separate conversation today here about academic freedom and social justice?
Thanks so much. Sure. But before I do that, let me just note that I think it's quite fitting that this conversation is occurring in a building that bears the name of the late intellectual, scholar, and liberation movement fighter, Neville Alexander. And I think his intellectual stature, his scholarly creativity, his rigor are good beacons for our discussion there tonight. And I think we must apply that rigor of Neville Alexander as we have this conversation. Because these conversations can degenerate sometimes into too much emotion. So let me start by observing in Mampela Rampela was mentioning that Mampela Rampela has observed often that you, Saleem, you have fire in your heart, but you also have ice in your head. And that's a view I embrace, actually. I'm quite proud of having that fire in my heart, but also ice in my head. And I think tonight's theme needs both. It needs the fire in the heart, but it also needs the ice in the head. Fire in the heart because I think when it comes to justice, Arundhati Roy puts it well, that we must never forget or get used to the unspeakable violence and the vulgar disparity of life that we see around us. Violence is not just about the genocide and the physical violence. But violence takes many forms, and it should affront our sensibilities. Right? So we must never forget or look away or get used to a social structure that underpins unbridled wealth and desperate grinding poverty, including in South Africa.
where 66% of families are food stressed, where 25% of our people are suffering from malnutrition. That's a different kind of violence. We can't get used to that. Where we have great privilege for the rich and grinding poverty for the impoverished in this country. And all of this is perpetuated with unspeakable violence, the most dramatic of which we find in Palestine and Gaza today. And I noted earlier at the launch of my book on Root First Research and Activism, that Ruth First wrote that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. And as a scholar, as a former university leader, I refuse to be silent, to be complicit, whether by omission or by commission when it comes to genocide. And I'll explain why as we proceed throughout the evening. To paraphrase Toni Morrison, Palestine is bleeding, and you cannot ignore its pain. But we cannot also succumb, in her words, to the malevolence that we witness. We must speak, we must act, we must write as best as we can, do whatever we can. And again, to paraphrase Toni Morrison, this is not the time for silence, for fear, or felicity. Fidel Castro was the one who remarked that the history of Africa will be written before and after the Battle of Quito Cunabale, that battle that happened in southern Angola, and was a breakthrough for Namibia's independence and eventually for our own democracy in 1990. My own view is that the history of humanity, in part, will be written before the 7th of October and after 7th of October. That's a huge claim, but I sincerely believe that. Because on that day, what happened and has occurred since has redefined and clarified so many things in this world. The ongoing struggles for freedom and justice on the one hand, whether against coloniality or rapacious oligarchic exploitation that we see unfolding in the United States, the slide into terrifying barbarism. Now it's coming home to me as students when we used to say socialism or barbarism. This barbarism is with us. The sheer hypocrisy and double standards we are seeing around us. It's breathtaking. It's almost an insult to our intelligence, this hypocrisy and double standards we are seeing. The unbridled complicity of much of the West, and not only the West, of large parts of the Muslim world, for those Muslims who want to cast this just as a Muslim-Jewish struggle, right? In the face of these genocides. And lastly, the fault lines we are seeing across countries and within our countries. We have to speak plainly. People are demonstrating that they're not just of a certain religion, they are Zionists. And in other contexts, other things. Okay. And I'm always reminded, and I ended, I think, my book on the forgotten people, political banishment, about 10 years ago, quoting Primo Levi, who warned, I think, prophetically, that what has happened before can happen again, and it's happening. So we need fire in the heart, but we also need ice in the head. Because while universities are vital institutions, and I've inhabited the university since I've been 17 years and 4 months old, and I've never left. It's a place that I believe very deeply in. I believe in the knowledge project and the importance of universities. These universities of ours, whether UCT or WITS or UWC, are not only precious, they are very fragile institutions. They can be easily destroyed. It takes one vice chancellor to destroy a university in a 5-year period. So I think we must be very careful when we have this discussion that we don't undermine and erode these institutions, because they are precious institutions. We cannot build a society, a democracy, without these kinds of institutions. So let's be very careful in how we conduct our discussions and debates and so on, because they are already under threat from the right wing and from liberals who are proving themselves not liberals anymore, but part of neocons and so on. So tonight I hope in this conversation, which is curated, to bring together several issues and concepts like academic freedom, institutional autonomy, public accountability, and social justice, and show the relationship between these four and why they're in a sense indivisible. And beyond this, I want you to keep in mind all the time that when we discuss these concepts, we must recognize that these concepts, these ideas exist within social structures, under certain relations that structure our relations of production, if you want, social relations that shape our notions of what is academic freedom. These are not just abstract ideas. So these discussions that we're going to have tonight are also happening within a particular system of governance that operates in South Africa, a notion of cooperative governance, right? And they are framed by a constitution, by the 1997 Higher Education Act, and two white papers of 1997 and 2015. So we can't cover all these matters in the time available, but I want you to keep in mind this overall frame as we have this discussion.
Thank you, Saleem. So if we start of those four that you listed, if we start with academic freedom, many of you in this room probably know that actually American jurisprudence on academic freedom is significantly informed by South African definitions of, or definition of academic freedom. In his 1957 judgment in Sweezy versus New Hampshire, Justice Felix Frankfurter cited a document that was published in South Africa in the same year. And he cites this document published by, or written by UCT and WITS academics, where the four essential freedoms of university were outlined. And this is the definition that is still referred to in the judgment, and still referred to, in fact, in the American Association of University Professors as they think about what academic freedom means today. So that definition and these four essential freedoms come from T.B. Davie, UCT's former vice chancellor. He was vice chancellor between 1948 and 1955. And UCT's annual academic freedom lecture series is still called T.B. Davie Academic Freedom. So it is probably not a mistake to say that that definition is still the dominant one in South Africa, as well as I just said more broadly. So if you could just share what your opinion is or how you view that definition.
Right. So T.B. Davies has been a very prominent definition of academic freedom in South Africa. As Anna says, it comes from UCT, former vice chancellor. And my own view is that in thinking about academic freedom, in thinking about institutional autonomy, we need to break with that paradigmatic trap of the past and from the understandings of the 1950 T.B. Davies formulation of academic freedom. And it's regularly trotted out in most uncreative ways, as if the world hasn't changed. So I think we must recast our conceptions of academic freedom, institutional autonomy, in ways that are more congruent with our times. And our times include that we are post-1994 now. We're not during the apartheid period. So Davies, to his credit, was really concerned about apartheid incursions into the universities. in the 1950s. And he conceived academic freedom, and I quote, as freedom from external interference, which was what was happening under apartheid, as freedom from internal interference in terms of who shall teach, what we teach, how we teach, and whom we teach. All very noble concerns in that context. Now, several observations can be made about that definition of what is called academic freedom. First, and here I must really credit the great UCT philosopher Andre Dutoit, who has pointed this out, that statement is really not a definition or statement on academic freedom. It's actually a statement on institutional autonomy. That Davies is actually conflating thoroughly academic freedom and institutional autonomy. So, second, to the extent that the rights of academics have been violated in the past, whether we think of Mafeji or Basil Moore at Rhodes and other similar cases, or we think about the rights of academics being still violated today, right? That formulation of Davies says nothing to us. It cannot account for that because it's about institutional autonomy. It's not about academic freedom, right? Third, with the intrusion of the market into higher education and the associated commercialization, commodification, marketization of our universities, the threat to academic freedom in recent years and today may be, if not much more, coming from the corporatist managers of our universities than from the state. And the formulation, again, cannot account for that. That it's our leaders of our universities and our managers that are intruding into the academic freedom of students and academics. And this is especially the case, as you've heard from Yusuf, about the demands that donors are making, outlandish demands that donors are making on our universities, or the kinds of contract research that our universities are doing for industry, right? Or the sponsored teaching programs that businesses are paying for at business schools and so on, where you deliver a particular set of outcomes to multinational corporations and businesses and so on, and anathema to real education, right? All those are not accounted for by the T.B. Davis formulation of academic freedom, which we lazily trot out all the time. And I was tempted here to go back to a 2006 lecture, but we're going to skip that, which makes the same mistake by a very prominent scholar in South Africa. And so, beyond those weaknesses, we must also ask ourselves whether that formula is really of much help post-1994, when we are no longer an apartheid society, but a democracy with a constitution, which guarantees all kinds of rights and so on. And so, post-94 and today, surely our notions of academic freedom, of institutional autonomy, must be conceived in relation to something we didn't have to worry about that much before 94, in relation to something called public accountability, or democratic accountability, if you want to call it, which was not a concern because we were living in a settler colonialist apartheid society. Today, it is different.
So as Yusuf, you really set the tone, and just to push that point a little bit further on academic freedom, institutional autonomy, all these questions have, of course, been hotly debated over the last 23 months. It really is nearly 2 years now. Many academics have been fired. Some were not appointed because of their views on Israel. This is mostly in the US or the UK. Articles have been pulled, like the one from the Harvard Law Journal. Full special issues have been pulled, and student protests were violently repressed, and students persecuted, disappeared. by ICE. So these stories are mainly from the U.S., and we know that there are significant differences, but there also are some similarities between the threats faced by South African universities and those in the U.S., especially when we think about, as mentioned just now and by Yusuf as well, donor threats actually already caught funding, but also the weaponization of the conflation between anti-Semitism and the criticism of Israel. And so I just wanted to further probe you or ask you to talk about how we can approach academic freedom in this quite frightening moment.
So I've noted, and let me build on the fact that we need meanings that are appropriate to the post-1994 period in South Africa and the global context that we find ourselves in, and the challenges that our universities are facing today. I've said that October 7 has redefined everything in this world, as far as I'm concerned. So we can't keep trotting out the old notions and definitions. We really need to rethink, re-theorize a lot of that. So we are seeing the most incredible incursions into academic freedom, the erosion of freedom, not just in the United States. Germany is the pits currently. I mean, it's mind-boggling that a country, that a state that perpetrated the Holocaust wants to tell us today what anti-Semitism is and what is not anti-Semitism. That wants to define for us which Jews are Jew haters and are not Jew haters when they criticize the likes of Judith Butler and others. I mean, this is inconceivable, what's happening in Germany, in parts of France, the United Kingdom, right? All countries that are complicit in genocide, okay? They're also extending to the right-wing attacks on universities in the United States by the likes of Trump, who seeks to roll back equity programs, diversity programs, prohibit critical race theory teaching and so on. I mean, this is shocking. I can't even conceive those things happening in South Africa, but it's happening in the so-called bastions of democracy. Put your mind around that. Right. I'm really proud to be an academic and a scholar in South Africa today. We possess far more academic freedom in this country than people possess in the United States, the UK, France, and Germany, and those. Let's be clear about that. Right. Our universities have far greater institutional autonomy than universities in the United States, public or private, or in Germany, or anywhere else for that matter. So I think it's very rich today for those countries to lecture us on democracy, on academic freedom and institutional autonomy. And we can build on that.
Yeah, if you can just maybe say something about the history, also how that came about, that
Sure.
to have these
Right.
kinds of freedom.
So before I come to the South Africa history, let me just, as a preamble, indicate what Ajay Skaria has put in a very nice article, Gaza and the Unsettling Equality of Academic Freedom, published in a recent edition of the journal Critical Times, which comes from the International Critical Theory Consortium that I serve on with Judith Butler and a whole lot of other really credible scholars. So Skaria writes, academic freedom is not just a concept, it is a principle. A concept or set of ideas that demands an existential commitment, not just lip service, commitment. A promise from its adherents, and a promise, moreover, that puts the promiser in relation of universality in the world. It's not just for one place and one country, it's a universal thing. Additionally, academic freedom is a very charged principle, I agree. It is the institutional manifestation of the very principle of the modern university, and arguably a principle more broadly of education as an autonomous institutional activity in modern societies. From its modern inception, the university has been institutionalized as a site for the search of knowledge that might challenge established authority, whether that of the state, society, or disciplinary guardians within the university itself. And such a search requires, and I agree, at its very foundation, the freedom that we call academic. It's different from freedom of expression and other kinds of freedoms that are important. There's something quite distinctive about academic freedom, and it's tied to an institution called a university. It doesn't operate in the same way in a hospital or in a state institution, right? Now, I want to remind ourselves that at CODESA, during the negotiations in the early 90s, and the other people in this room will have this memory too, we fought for academic freedom and freedom of scientific research to be constitutional rights. Section 16 of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa enshrines those rights. The preamble of the 1997 Higher Education Act, and there are people here who shaped those acts, right, compels us to respect and encourage academic freedom, freedom of speech, expression, creativity, scholarship, and research. And among these rights, academic freedom is a particular right bestowed on us academics collectively. I'll come back to this individualist notion of academic freedom. It's a collective right that applies to us as academics, as peers. Right? So it is a freedom, as I understand it, it is a freedom of university scholars to teach, research, creatively express themselves, publish, speak, and participate freely. Not just on matters related to teaching and research, also on institutional policy and institutional governance and other issues without interference from university leaders and managers, donors, and other internal and external bodies. This is a very important right that we have as academics. You've heard me say on other platforms, we need to take back the senates of our universities from the university managers. They've intruded too much into the senates of our universities. That is an academic space. That is where we practice academic self-rule. And we hold the principal and vice chancellors accountable in senates to the academic project. So, for me, one of the things this academic freedom as a gift provides me is that we must creatively and purposefully use this academic freedom to produce and advance knowledge of all kinds, to foster innovations and technologies that address the wicked problems of our society, whether it's gender-based violence, the lack of clean air and water, and so on and so on. For another, this academic freedom means that I must ensure that I cultivate amongst my students a deep respect for ideas, for knowledge, for truth, that I need to induct them into the professional practice of producing knowledge and the search for the truth, as well as expertise, competencies, skills, and so on. And into inducting them to understand the methodologies that we use for doing all these kinds of things. It also means, and this is a message to everyone on the right and on the left, it also means that our scholarship and our research is characterized by honest, dispassionate, disinterested pursuit of truth, and is not sacrifice on the altars of the chase for promotions and becoming professor within 5 years, or private profit, or narrow donor demands, or political expediency for whoever is in power, or for dubious institutional rankings too, because they have no science behind them. This annual regalia of we number one in Africa and South Africa and so on. In short, it's about the pursuit of Said, of speaking truth to power. When you have to speak truth to power. And through action, projecting and acting for a better world. So, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, we have the gift of academic freedom to do all these things. What increasingly is not possible in the US, the UK, and elsewhere. And I want to end up to say this. This is the calling of our profession as academics, which seemingly is lost on many academics. They seem to just see this profession as just a job. It's just another occupation. No, I'm sorry, you're in the wrong business. It's not just another occupation. It's a special calling. It's a profession. It's different from an occupation.
So especially for those of you who were there in the book launch earlier, but also just from what you now said, it's quite obvious that for you, this public good and academic freedom are two conceptions that are indivisible. And I want to emphasize that just because of what we're seeing in relation to what we can do as teachers, but also as scholars. You know, if I want to quote the renowned historian at Columbia University, Rashid Khalidi, who in an open letter said that, or announced that he's withdrawing his classes because it has become impossible to teach what he wanted to teach on Israel and Palestine. And he referenced this process as basically the emergence of the anti-university. So the university, from a place of exchanging ideas freely, talking freely, debating, exposing our students to different opinions and letting them debate, letting them, God forbid, feel uncomfortable and challenged in their positions. So what is for you, you know, if we want to again cite A.J. Scaria's article, which poses this eternal question, what is the university for in the face of this emerging anti-university? And unfortunately, is not as far from here as we wish, right? What for you, from the vantage point of post-apartheid public universities in South Africa, is the university for, right? Yeah.
Okay, so this is something that has been occupying me for about the last 4 years. A project hopefully resulting in a book that's trying to answer this question. What is the university for? What is it and why do we want universities in South Africa? What purposes do we want them to serve? And I'm looking at this and trying to trace it from the colonial period through to segregation, through to apartheid and post-1994. And what have been the continuities, what have been the discontinuities, and so on. So I see the university and I see academic freedom as irrecoverably connected to advancing the common public good. And if you want to advance the public good, you have to also leave space for public accountability. And that's because of the university's social purposes, educational purposes of firstly, and there's only 3 as far as I'm concerned, it's about disseminating knowledge, it's about producing knowledge, and it's community engagement. And if those are the 3 purposes of a university, there are a whole lot of roles that universities have to play, a whole lot of functions that you have to undertake. Right? I'll come back to those social purposes. Now, critical as a right that academic freedom is, I don't see it as an absolute right with no restraints. It's not an absolute right with no restraints. Academic freedom does not extend to academics being advocates of genocide and war, being complicit by omission or commission in genocide, or inciting violence like they did with tragic results in Rwanda, or fostering hatred based on class, or race, or gender, ethnicity, nationality, or religion. No, you do not get away with those things in the name of academic freedom, I'm sorry. Nor, I want to also, again, speak more to the left here. Nor, as I've learned from my wise mentor, Haropi, nor does it extend to research becoming a mere political instrument, never producing any knowledge, because it's already a political ideology. That's propaganda. That's not research. That's not production of knowledge, right? So as the Italian theorist Antonio Gramsci insisted, research must produce knowledge for politics without cutting itself off from the objective and scientific investigation of the world. And you can argue about the objective part and all that, right? And how do you do that? And I think the Ruth First book, there's a strong argument about how you can be objective and rigorous and so on. Being passionate is not going to help you find the cure for HIV/AIDS. Being dispassionate and disinterested may help you find that, right? So I'm also skeptical, extremely doubtful about academic freedom being seen as a purely individual right and being viewed in individualistic terms. In Sufism, there's this word called nafs. That's the ego. We must get rid of that because academics tend to be too individualistic sometimes. Right? It's not an individual right alone. It's a peer right. Right? So when we are sitting and planning the curriculum or the syllabi for Sociology 1, Saleem can't turn around and say, over my dead body, am I going to teach Durkheim? Because I only teach Marx. Over my dead body, are you going to prescribe suicide? They should be reading the Communist Manifesto. Right? That's not about a defense of your academic freedom. That's your individualism, where you think you can do whatever you want in a classroom. It's a peer right. It's something we negotiate. We come and put our heads together about what is the best syllabus, what is the appropriate curriculum for undergraduates, and so on. So that you can't use that and claim academic freedom on those kinds of grounds. That, I think, is individualism of the worst kind. And I'm afraid I see too much of that in our universities, amongst academics. So is the idea that one can say anything one wants in the name of academic freedom. That you can use the classroom to propagandize, whether for the right or for the ANC or for the left. Or you can, as I've already said, promote genocide or hatred in the classroom. Or invite people who promote and deny the Holocaust or promote genocide. It's my academic freedom to invite her, even though she can come and stand here and say the Holocaust never happened. That's not academic freedom that we're talking about. That's something mal, honestly, crazy, right? So I think we are bound by certain moral principles, ethical standards, and I want to remind us as South Africans, we are bound by this thing called the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the values and the imperatives it has. And we who have been subject to settler colonialism, who have been subject to apartheid, who have been experiencing its brutality should know these things better. Right? There is something called peer accountability to our peers as historians or sociologists or as humanists and so on. Right? There's also disciplinary accountability in relation to how we undertake research. That's why, for good reasons, we have something called peer review. We all hate that peer review comments that's coming on our book, but it's there for a good reason. It keeps us honest if it's done well. Okay, so I think our scholarship involves questions of competence, ethics, collective responsibility. You can't just say, I want to write what I want, and if you don't publish in the journal, you're being a gatekeeper. Yeah, they are gatekeepers, but sometimes the peer reviews play a very important role of keeping all of us honest and maybe protecting society from some of us too.
Right. Saleem, I see that time is marching, and I really want to make sure that those of you in the audience have a chance to ask questions, because it's not every day that we have you stand here. So I'm going to mush a few of our questions into one. And I would like to invite you to talk a little bit about institutional autonomy as distinct from academic freedom. You mentioned this, but if you want to expand on it, but then also how you think about institutional autonomy, similarly to what you said about academic freedom as relative autonomy, both in relation to society, government, but also within, right, within the institution, which I think is, again, something that we need to grapple with, the various decision-making bodies within the university. Yeah, let's celebrate those.
So, if academic freedom and institutional autonomy are the same thing, why have two terms for it? So they obviously are different things, right? And again, here I must pay homage to Professor Andre du Toit, who I learned a lot about these issues from. So institutional autonomy is the autonomy of the university from the state, from government and other bodies, including donors, in undertaking its critical social functions and its education and social purposes, right? Again, the dissemination of knowledge, the production of knowledge, community engagement, if you want to add that. Now, here's the difference. As much as in the early 90s within CODESA, we fought for academic freedom to be a constitutional right. We oppose institutional autonomy being a constitutional right. Why do you think we did that? Because some of us were smart and alert to the fact that there were going to be universities in this country, one mentioned it, that we were going to use institutional autonomy to resist transformation, to use current language to resist decolonization. Okay? They were fighting for institutional autonomy to beat the Constitution. Okay? So we sought for institutional autonomy to be an important plank of national policy, not of the Constitution. And it is. It's a very important plank. The higher education access, very clearly, it's desirable for universities to enjoy freedom and autonomy in their relationship with the state. That's there. But there's an important rider. Complete the sentence, please. Within the context of public accountability. It's not just any autonomy, right? So institutional autonomy is not an absolute autonomy. It's a relative autonomy. So I think this is a very important distinction. The relative autonomy and the absolute autonomy, okay? So that autonomy, what UCT does with its budget, with its curriculum, what degree programs it has, what research it conducts, all that, it has the autonomy to do that. But with due regard to public accountability. So some would like to distinguish, and I think this is fertile areas to look at, between public accountability, democratic accountability, social accountability. Ruth Jonathan, who was at Edinburgh University, was teasing out some of these concepts and the difference between these different kinds of accountability and so on. But the basic idea is the accountability of universities. Firstly, accounting, in strict terms, accounting for all the taxpayers' money we give them. You have to account for that money. You have to account for your performance relative to the purposes and your vision and mission that you divide. Are you actually pursuing that? Are you doing that effectively? Are you doing that with high quality? And so on, right? Now, so that's where we make the distinction between fitness of purpose and fitness for purpose. You must be both as a university, right? So I alluded to this already. Apart from institutional autonomy, and I have less sleep worries around that vis-a-vis the state today, for different reasons. The state is so incapacitated today. The Department of Higher Education Training is so lacking in any expertise, they haven't got time to worry about universities, sadly. Right? I worry more about something internal to universities. Whether there's enough protection, respect, and promotion of the autonomy of academic departments and the scholars within the university. And whether they're having enough protection from the corporatists who are seeking to run our universities like businesses. Because a business is a hierarchy. When the CEO says produce, you produce. We don't ask questions. A university is not a hierarchy. It is a holyarchy. meaning that the independent units have a lot of autonomy, and they must have autonomy. The Vice-Chancellor must never imagine that he can be dirigist, that he or she can dictate what politics departments should be doing as research, or what they should be teaching. Any Vice-Chancellor like that should be shown the door, because that's interfering in the autonomy, the intellectual autonomy of academic departments, of individual scholars, and things like that. And that autonomy, colleagues, must apply to the senates of our university. The leaders of our university and our managers must be very careful how they interact with the senates of our universities. It's gone too far already. I consider many of them interfering in the senates of our universities. And what I find shameful, and I'll ask that question again, where the hell are the academics? Where are the professors who are resisting these intrusions into our Senate? Okay? So, we can shout and we can cry, the commercialization that's happening, the commodification that's happening, the corporatization that's happening, it will carry on until academics. And I know there's a world of difference between a senior professor like myself and an early career scholar. I'm not mindful of the power relations. I mentor about 10 young early career scholars. They are brilliant. The advice I give them is very sensible. You can be assured of that. They cannot speak in the way I speak, right? But they should be able to speak the way I speak, because they should be guaranteed the autonomy to respectfully speak back, to contest, to participate in institutional policy issues and so on. Instead of what we're happening, some of the smartest young scholars are leaving our universities. They do not see the university as a space for them anymore. That's a tragedy. We're going to pay the price for this in the years to come. So we need to call out our peers who are sometimes infringing on their autonomy and our own autonomy by some of the practices they get into. When I got to Rhodes University as Vice-Chancellor, I was shocked by some of the decisions that have been taken before me. Someone did a master's thesis on Hansi Cronje. Have you ever read that master's thesis? No one even knew there was a master's thesis on Hansi Cronje, because some academic and some dean decided that shall be locked up forever. That was a condition of which the research was. A master's thesis which is meant to be in the library. So sometimes we have to be protected from our own academics who, for whatever crazy reasons, agree to all kinds of things. So I want to really warn ourselves, don't only look outside on the state, look inside at what we're allowing as practices, because we're going to pay the price for those things.
Yes, and again, I'll speed up our conversation a little bit and connect this last point that you made about, or the question that you posed, where are the university professors? We know that there are professors, many of you are sitting here, who are challenging what is happening, but of course, many more are still silent. And the last question I want to pose now, and then we can see if there's time for more, is where Yusuf started us off. So last year you were awarded the Asaf Gold Medal Award for, let me just get this title right, for outstanding application of scientific and scholarly thinking in service of society. And you donated your award to the South African BDS movement, partly because obviously you wanted to support the cause, but also to make this point that universities in South Africa should not be silent. And so to expand what you have been saying about, the connection between academic freedom and the public good, and how our scholarship has to continue to pursue these wicked problems and is not divisible from our concern about society, that applies also to global society, if there is something like that, right? So in the context of post-apartheid South Africa, it seems to me, and probably to you, but you will say so that academic boycott would be quite a natural move as a resistance or expression for what our universities think is right, not least because of the role of academic and other boycott meant for as pressure for apartheid in South Africa. And of course, we also know that many South African universities have already introduced boycotts or similar measures. So University of the Western Cape, Fort Hare, Nelson Mandela, UNISA, and University of Benda all have measures that are either complete boycotts or something very close to that. So I want to just ask you what your opinion is on academic boycott.
I should just add, because my former institution grows in a very close partnership with Utrecht. And yesterday I read that Utrecht has done the right thing. This is a major breakthrough for an institution in Europe, because it's a major university in Europe calling for an academic boycott and calling on their government also to implement an academic boycott. I think that's a major victory for us that we should be inspired by. So before answering that very quickly, so let me just bring home that the public accountability, the public good aspect of our universities, there are duties that inhere in that. We are responsible for creating a different kind of society. There are duties that inhere in academic freedom, of contributing to social justice, of contributing to the kind of constitutional imperatives, of ensuring access, not just physical, but also epistemic, and not just epistemic, also access to different epistemologies at UCT, not the old plodding ones that we have been force-fed for decades. These are all obligations that our Constitution directs us towards. We cannot neglect or negate those in the name of institutional autonomy and academic freedom. Right. There are responsibilities that we have. But to come back to the academic boycott, so why do I advocate for support the academic boycott of Israel? Because for me, it's the activation of the principle of academic freedom. I'm using the principle of academic freedom to support and advocate for an academic boycott. I supported it as one of the tactics. And again, we must be clear about what it is. Is it a principle? Is it a strategy? Is it a tactic? These words matter of how we conceive of these things. Right? So I support it as a tactic to bring apartheid to its knees, together with sanctions, together with kicking apartheid South Africa out of sport and things like that. And that's why I'll put my weight behind kicking Israel out of soccer and putting pressure on FIFA. Right. So it's a tactic to bring an end to genocide and settler colonialism in Israel. I see it as a way, myself personally, as a way of being consistent. I did it under apartheid. I must do it now. I see it as a way of being consistent and advancing the constitution of this country, which doesn't circumscribe me to South Africa, which asks me to be a citizen of the world. Right. I subscribe to it because it's something I can do to promote the oneness of humanity, rather than just South Africans or Africans. I subscribe to it because it's a way to fight for certain values, not just in South Africa, but more globally. Right. So I'm very comfortable about promoting the academic boycott and advocating for that. Secondly, I see it as a way, as a scholar, of not colluding with Israeli universities and Israeli academics, who are either complicit directly to the research they do for the Israeli state, or are silent about genocide and settler colonialism, scholasticide, epistemicide, and all that. I think it's sheer hypocrisy for Zionists and their supporters to cry about the violation of academic freedom when they not only deny academic freedom to Palestinians, right? But also destroy the entire infrastructure of Palestinian education and higher education. That is hypocrisy, right? That said, I'll always insist, we must be very judicious about how we use tactics like this. We must be very sober and clear-headed. I want to say we must collaborate with the Israeli academics and institutions that with great courage uphold the humanity of Palestinians and speak out and act against Zionist barbarism. Why punish them? Our boycott here was a selective boycott. It wasn't an absolute boycott. We allowed people to come in here as part of the academic boycott who were on our side. So I think it's quite consistent, like we did at Stellenbosch a few years ago, when we said to one of our colleagues, the problem with your conference is that we are speaking about reparations and violence, and there's not a single Palestinian because they can't afford to come here. But you have 7 self-funded Israelis coming to this conference. I don't have a problem with that. Will they stand up and say they oppose secular colonialism? Then they can come. So I think we must be careful of making this absolute, because we mustn't forget, I want to end up with this. Our approach must be based on humanity, love, care, and solidarity. This is not about vengeance.
Thank you, Sunny. We have about half an hour for Q&A.
I wanted to ask a question about a term which didn't come into your presentation. One of the terms which is being mobilized in that pushback. I'd like to spot your thoughts on that term. But the term, I know you're familiar with it, is institutional neutrality, where there's a group of academics who are saying, and it's not just in South Africa, it's in the USA, appealing to the Calvin principles, the Chicago principles, the heterodox academy. And there's a whole group of people who are saying, because the university is so fragile as an institution, a way it's protected itself, or there's been a pact over 100 years, more or less now, where institutions have agreed not to make statements as institutions so as not to divide the academic body and to protect itself from retaliation, such as we've seen massively from donor funding and or from the state. And that's the term which is being currently, from meetings last week, it's currently being mobilized to try and rescind the very important and Gaza statements that have been made. So I just wanted to, what are your thoughts on that term and how to combat that manipulation of the idea?
Thank you. Desmond Thompson, I'm a journalist. I want to know what the panelists think about other universities not having made statements and using the argument of academic freedom or institutional autonomy. Are they hiding behind it, and should they also be making statements like the various structures at UCT?
Hi, so I'm based in London, and I was one of the proposers of one of the motions at UCT. Thanks so much for this panel. I was really struck by the idea that we exist in an ecosystem. So today, a Palestinian doctor who we're collaborating with, we're talking about how his papers have consistently had the artile from reviewers because he's using the G word and he gets pushed to take out the G word. And I think those are academics who come out of universities. So are we training people who are going out there and simply reproducing the same kind of notions of academic freedom in all the bits of the ecosystem, the research funders, the reviews, the editors of journals, conference organizers? So perhaps we can comment about our role, sort of when you talk about public about accountability, we produce the intellectuals for every bit of the academic project.
So I'll take Desmond's question first. I think you've heard me say this, Desmond, that firstly, I want to repeat, as a former chairperson of University of South Africa, how appalled I am that the premier body that represents universities in South Africa has stayed silent till today. Not even gestures towards supporting academics who are being subject to genocide and so on. I mean, I don't think it deserves the right to call itself the premier body of universities in South Africa. So I want to register that again. Not even prepared to have a debate. What are you modeling if you're not even prepared to have a debate? We are meant to be knowledge institutions where we debate. There should be no holy cows. So, secondly, I'm always mindful of positionality. I think it's very important, and I've tried to do this all the time in my life, having been a student militant, have been an academic, having been a vice-chancellor, having been an advisor to the minister, always saying, how would I look at this if I was a student? As a vice-chancellor, an academic. It's about positionality. So let me say openly today, if I was still vice-chancellor of Rhodes University today, I would be very mindful. You would find me signing everything as Saleem Badat, not as vice-chancellor. Because there's a very important distinction to be made there. Saleem Badat will sign as Vice-Chancellor of Rhodes University when the Senate of the university, and after every faculty has voted on this issue, and when the council has endorsed it. I think we must be very clear about this. Giving leadership, I believe in that, but not running so far ahead where it's hollow. You must win the support for these things, department by department, faculty by faculty, rather than just imposing this. You cannot be lazy in this kind of situations. I would be doing the calculations constantly at Rhodes about which faculties am I going to win? How am I going to win some people over? What will the vote be in Senate? I will only go when I'm ready, because I'm not going to want to lose this one. And that happened in the past when I got the university. So just to, many people said, are you going to apologize for Rhodes University in your inaugural? What the hell am I to apologize as a black South African? It happened 2 years later when I was confident I could get the university senate and the council to apologize for the public shame of Rhodes University. I'm not a maverick, right? You need to lead, but you need to lead with circumspection. Right? So if after 6 months, Desmond, I was still not sure, don't confuse my position with Rhodes's position. Too many of us are confusing those things. Right? And I would be public at some point to say, I'm still trying to persuade my institution. You know my position. I want an institutional position. Because Saleem speaking out is not adequate. I want Rhodes to speak out. And not just to speak out, to also understand the implications of what it's doing. Through an open debate where no one is intimidated as people are being intimidated in too many senates of too many universities in this country. In the most horrific ways, in my view. Okay? So I want to just clarify that. So there are still institutions that have not spoken out. I think they must settle. They haven't even put it on the agenda, for heaven's sake, It's a non-issue. But let me remind us that some of those universities are not historically white universities. They are historically black universities. And I think we must get our heads around why that is happening. Institutions that want to claim to have been in the forefront of the anti-apartheid struggle haven't even discussed this matter. And if we're calling out people and are talking openly about this, where the hell is the student movement in this country? Where are the leaders of Fees Must Fall and Roads Must Fall? Have you seen anything from from SASCO and all these student movements? How do you account for that? And this is where I think there's a lot of introspection required about how strong really are we? How strong are we? I know we are doing incredible work in small numbers and so on. But have we built a mass movement in the last 2 years around this issue? A mass movement that could also start to be engaged around the issues we need to take care of in this country. Where are the unions? Right? I think it's time for some serious introspection. Amilcar Cabral, claim no easy victories, tell no lies. Time for introspection around this thing. So that's what my response is, Desmond. Let's think about these things. Why haven't those institutions taken a stand? Is it only leadership? Maybe there's no rank and file campaigning for any of this. So, John, your question is hugely important. And I think we should read that Scaria article that you referred to also about the different notions and put our heads around that. I certainly want to read it more than once. About the different traditions that are underlying these different views on the academic boycott and so on. So I think the question you're raising about institutional neutrality is a very important one, and I'd like to think much more about that. But perhaps there are others who want to respond to that, of how one engages with this kind of thing. But I wouldn't want to just say, BS. I think we need to think deeply about this and to hear the other side, as part of an ethic of care, of hearing, of listening, and arriving at a position and having thought about that, and rather just rejecting a position. That's all I can say for the moment, but I think it's a hugely important question. Ultimately, I think I know gut level where I'll come down, right? But I would like to know why I come down on that.
Do you want to say something to Leslie's question about the... I'll try. Thank you. I want to start by addressing the question about neutrality. So Azim printed out several copies of UCT's guiding principles on academic freedom, etc., which state very clearly that neutrality is not the UCT's approach, right? UCT is very much in line with the way, or these principles anyway, with the way Saleem spoke about the university's relationship to society, is guided by other protocols such as the Kampala Declaration, which do not require the university to be neutral. But this question, and still, regardless of the fact that these are the principles accepted in our institution, this position comes up and is very strong and threatens the resolutions as well as all sorts of other conversations. And I want to, with reference to the leadership's position about dialogue, and everything has to, all positions have to be listened to, and we can continue the dialogue in a very kind of Habermasian liberal approach to the space for dialogue and public spaces. So Suren earlier today shared the Utrecht University's statement on academic boycott, and I think it has a bit that speaks to this idea of neutrality. So I'll read a little bit from that. So the rector says, "As an academy, we have a duty to provide space for dialogue and for research that contributes to understanding and to solutions that do justice to peace and justice. This requires openness, even when it is difficult. It requires us to continue to meet each other in dialogue with respect for differences. But It is also clear when there is a genocidal violence and the line that has been crossed, the call by demonstrating students and staff has been heard. So this but was what I wanted to mention, that there is a point, right, where we do not anymore have to listen to all the viewpoints because there's a clear moral position on how the university has to speak. And so in relation to that, yeah, the silence is staggering. But I hear what you're saying about leadership and readiness. And to Leslie's point on are we educating these, I don't know, lukewarm position or students with lukewarm positions, hopefully not. But as Richie said earlier today at the book launch, we are not. We shouldn't be, and the threat is much weaker than elsewhere, where the penalization of critiquing Israel is actually codified in university legislation, such as at Columbia. But it's also true that we have to watch what we say, right? So it's not always a question of us having, or we don't always, or maybe not anymore, always have the freedom to take the positions. Some of us will, regardless, and then someone will come and talk to our students about, well, what the proper relationship between politics and scholarship should be, right? We are put back in our places when we transgress that boundary. So is it all up to us is my question.
So come back. So it's just to come back to John. So, in some sense, I know how to respond, but I think yours is a more deeper question. I know you too well to just responding that way. I think there's something much more at play here when you ask that question. It's not just an easy answer to John, right? Now, maybe we're overcomplicating the question, right? But I think there's something else at play here. And I would want to hear much more about it from you also, about what are the concerns here? Because there must be deep concerns, right? Because you have the answers to some extent, or you don't. And I think you're worrying about how we get to the right answer. And that's what I'm hearing from you. Okay. In the same way that the work you did for me years ago on institutional culture still troubles me, but it's so easy to tell everyone we know what institutional culture is, but you demonstrate it's not so easy. We really need to think about these issues very deeply, and so because we could make terrifying mistakes otherwise if we're not careful about some of these things. But Leslie, I was also hearing something else, and again, as I said, I entered university at 17, and I'm still at a university and love it, right? I'm having to come around to something that James Mulder said years ago at UCT about how glib we are about the graduates we produce and the people we mentor and things like that. And that how difficult we find it to come around to the fact that for every activist and brilliant scholar who's on the right side where we point, there are 10 others on the other side, right, who are slotting into reproduce capitalism, oligarchy, and all that. But we only want to point to the activists we have produced. We keep quiet about all those other graduates. And that's the dilemma about the role that our universities play in a certain conjuncture where there's a particular balance of forces and so on. I know we as left scholars find this very hard to accept, but I think we must take it on the chin too. For every wonderful activist and person with wonderful values we produce, we also produce all kinds of other people who do not worry about the things that we produce about. They are materialistic, they are narcissists, all those things. And they're running around running our country at the moment. Is that a failure of the university? No, I'm not prepared to say that's a failure. But I don't have an answer for that,
I have a question, and my name is Brilliant, and my question is, as a young man who's studying a bachelor in education and who's aspiring to become a scholar, how do I incorporate the concept of belong and in rooms that are walking, in daily dialogues that I engage in? And I'm asking this because as a future educator, what I learn currently, today or tomorrow, does not only impact me, but each and every student that I'll be teaching to. So I want to know, how do I make academic freedom not a foreign concept, not only to me, but into other people and other future educators or in other communities and other institutions too, Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anna, thank you, Saleem, and thank you, Yusuf. I actually just want to amplify a point that Anna's made, because, in many spaces, those of us that are, strong supporters of the resolution are facing this kind of pushback. There is a way in which liberal languages of consensus building, unity, diversity of perspectives, which all seem perfectly acceptable language, is a way to be pushing back against the resolutions at this institution. And I would like maybe some creative and critical thinking around, and that's why I really appreciate Saleem's point and Yusuf's point earlier about the public good, about moral clarity, and about accountability. But I would like us to think strategically of how to push back more strongly. Because this is the language of unity, consensus, collegiality, all of these things that are being introduced to make space for genocidal politics.
I just want to pick up on Sadia's points and problematize this notion of institutional neutrality. Both the speakers and Yusuf have pointed out how critical notions of public accountability are for thinking about the role of public universities in the world today. So if we look at the question of neutrality, let's just say from the perspective of students who are at our institutions today, it makes me think, what message are those students getting about the university on the one hand, claiming to be promoting public good, to be talking about concerns of social justice, to, in their mission statements, to be professing the desire to play a key role in advancing social justice and to be known as a university that is doing so. Wonderful words. But is silent in the face of this ghastly genocide. What message does that send to our students? I can't interpret that in any other way other than to interpret it that it's not important for the universities to be making a stand on big moral issues confronting us today. Now, if we look at the moral issues confronting us today, what bigger moral issue faces our world and our society other than the genocide? So that's, for me, a big way, one way of problematizing the notion of neutrality. But I also don't buy the fact that it's possible to be neutral. In a context where there are very contested views, surely debate and discussion and argument should be focused on why it is important for a university to take a position in a context where there's a moral outbreak and where we're witnessing in real time a genocide. So if you're not taking up a position, let me rephrase that. The argument is, because it's polarized and because some people feel that it's not a genocide or that it's to take a hard position means that you're being anti-Semitic. Well, by being quiet, you are actually taking up a position. You're taking up a position for those, or in line with those, who are making that argument. And you're taking up that position against those in the institution who are arguing that it is an issue which requires an institutional position. You can't be neutral. You have to take a position, and if you're quiet, as we are saying with the European powers in relation to arms embargoes, by being quiet and by not stopping arms and embargoes, you are being complicit. And I would like to push Saleem a bit further. How is it possible to be neutral in the context of what you started out with at the beginning, around a focus on the role of the university in promoting public good and being held accountable for our constitutional values? How is it possible to be neutral?
Let me just clarify. I'm not advocating an institutional neutrality position myself, but I'm wondering what the concern might be in terms of what would be lost. Am I missing something, right? So whether now or if I'm still Vice Chancellor of Rhodes, I'd be having two columns. On the one hand, the argument that the campus is going to be divided. And I wouldn't buy that because it's already divided, right? Then I would say you're creating hostile conditions for some constituencies. How exactly? Yeah. Through vigorous debate? Well, then they should get other jobs if they can't take part in vigorous debates, right? So that's on the one side. On the other side, I would say exactly what you said. What are we modeling for our students here? I would then say, what about the constitutional obligations about advancing the public good, etc., etc.? So I would be agonizing about this late into the night and early into the morning. And once I'm convinced myself as a Vice Chancellor, I'll be fighting and arguing for this, faculty by faculty, in Senate and within the Council, right? So this is not about buying into that position, right? Because as you say, otherwise, ultimately, you're complicit by keeping quiet. But I think we must do that hard work and marshal the arguments the way you are doing. And I think that's the productive thing, that we shouldn't be just glib about these kinds of things, you know. So that's what I'm pleading for. Do the hard work, institution by institution. Read the balance of forces in your institution. If you're not going to win them over tomorrow, when might you be able to win them over? And I would want to engage with academics with the utmost of respect, without assuming everyone is hostile. I would say there's a whole middle category, which I learned at Rhodes, that can be won over to a public apology. And some of that very important people are the professors in the science faculty. Because the moment one or two of them stand up, the rest will fall into line. I've seen that. So it's about, I'm afraid there's no place for me in a university for dirigisme. Issuing of decrees from a Vice Chancellor's office, you've lost the plot already. You've got to intellectually persuade, marshal the arguments. So when I respond to, maybe I'm overcomplicating John's question, but that's what I've been trying to do as, you know, I want to be persuaded myself what those arguments are. But instinctively, I don't buy the institutional neutrality position. I think too much is lost trying to maintain that position.
I think what you're saying is so important, and yes, of course, the conversations about neutrality, about what Sarah is saying, there is a way in which that language, which in fact some of us uphold and more hear the concept of collegiality, the concept of unity, the concept of all of these academic freedom, institutional autonomy, these are all very important things to us as academics. And yet, of course, it can be folded into and find confluence in very neoliberal and democratic practices. And I think that if we, if we take seriously, you're saying where's the students and where's the unions, and it's all part of the same kind of thing, right? Which is, have we really understood what having what the university means in neoliberal times, and what it's doing to conversations about democracy, about what students were saying about institutional culture. I don't think we've taken that seriously. I don't think many of us even think about the university as a space that is inculcating democratic practices. Most commenting that universities are not democratic. In fact, many people will not even experience democracy within a university, except maybe the students who vote for the SRC. But how those things play out, who gets to sit on which committees, who goes where, it's not that these things are not really spoken about clearly. And I think that even the language of decolonization is being folded in. So I completely agree with you. I found this incredibly important. The idea of numbers and persuasion, I think, is incredibly important. I'm not sure how we are going to, again, build that democratic culture in the university space where we actually have a debate where we engage each other. Because actually, that's not happening. People are hiding behind many things, but an open debate is not happening. And I'm just wondering, how do we do that now? How do we regain that space? And I'm finding that's a very difficult thing to grapple with.
Yeah, I have two comments. The one is in response to Yusuf's outlining of the struggles around transformation of the university and what we're seeing now in relation to the Gaza resolution. And, sitting where I sit in the institution, one of the things that has really bothered me is how easily it is for the institution to ignore the hard-won struggles for what you've just described. Academic freedom, institutional autonomy, public accountability, our need to be socially responsive and to be concerned about the public good. And perhaps it's because we went through these struggles in relation to CODESA, in relation to debating the higher education legislation and the white paper, that these things sit so strongly in the space that we're sitting in now. But within the institution, it's so easily disregarded. And the question is, have we failed in the transformation endeavor, which is where Yusuf's point comes in. In addition to that, this whole issue around the Mendelssohn application and the donor involvement, UCT has a fundraising and stewardship policy that outlines its values. It says under no circumstances should donors intervene in the institution's business. It protects its academic freedom through its own policies. That's also ignored. And it really, really is disturbing that we've reached 2025 after these hard struggles to get that institutionalized through legislation, through the Constitution, and it's ignored. My second point, Saleem, is something that's kind of in my head, and it's linked to resistance. Student resistance, academic resistance, and the role that resistance movements have played in universities, and these struggles for a better world, struggles for public good, for the public good. Because in a sense, I think that those struggles for academic freedom are also having the ability for students to resist around issues of the public good. And when we look at student resistance throughout the world over history, they've played a significant role around accountability. And I really think, and I know you've done a lot of work on student resistance, that it's important that you bring that argument in much more strongly than you've done in your presentation to us. Because I think that it's a really important part of academic freedom, is the ability to have that resistance and to respect it as a space, not to be suppressed. And so I just wanted that continuum between public good, public accountability, academic freedom, and social responsiveness to pull it together. Thank you.
Kelly Gillespie from UWC will be gathered 70% democratic growth through the Senex for full boycott of Israel. So I feel very proud of that. It's exactly the principles, commitment to democratic process that Saleem, I really respect what you said. And I see this happening at this university right now. So I want to respectfully push Carmelita a little bit, because I think Alison has granted UCT a kind of rigor in this moment that I think is gifting this university with the fight around democratic process, and pushing the university out of a kind of democratic isolationist dynamic practice. I feel very inspired by. So I think the fight is on here, and it's very, very inspiring to see that process and how it's actually enlivening a democratic process in the institution itself. But I also want to say that I think that the claim on democratic process shouldn't only, I hear that also in some of your comments, it shouldn't be only at the university. We need to take responsibility for pushing that democratic process well beyond the university into what you call community engagement, but that we could also call a kind of public mandate. How do we think about our own claim on academic freedom as a responsibility to serve, and therefore to be committed to and connected to struggles not only of students on our campuses, but struggles going on in our society. And I think this is one of the most important essays about the demise and the attack on academic freedom in the US, because after the big student movements and social protests of the 1960s in the US, so many left scholars went into university and then became elitists. And so it's so easy to attack them now, because they're separated from any kind of democratic base, any kind of collective social process. So I think we have to be extremely extremely mindful right now that the democracy is not only accountability internal to institutions, but it's accountability to the urgent social questions in our society and struggles that are going on in our society. We have to bear that in mind. Otherwise, we'll be, we will have what's happening in the US happen to us.
I note with some concern how few students are in the room. And I read a focus by Björn Hunt at Psychopolitics, where he argues that under neoliberalism, the self becomes the project. And socially, you're constantly curating yourself. And I think many of our students have fallen in to that space. So even as we're thinking around how do we open up, how do we get the university behind values? I think there's a larger context here which has everything to do with 35 years since 1990, where we've had the ascendance of Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and Historical Struggle, which has given us, and particularly given us students, it's coming, in 35 years of higher education, advancing the idea that pure individualism is what it's all about, the self is your project, and that all other values, values no longer mean anything. And I think we really, across the university is this rise of individualism. And I think a very big part of thank you, Kenny, for bringing an idea that Gaza is a moment that compels us to differ with, as you said, Saleem, October 7th, there's before and there's after. October, the set of the thing, we're building on what you said, it's the line in the sand for Francis Fukuyama's End of History. And part of the issues that we have right now is we have students who in a sense we need another peak up. We need another movement of consciousness, of the consciousness of historical struggle that protects of the society. We won't have to be subject to market forces and subject to this constant need to produce and market and frame yourself every single day on social media, yourself as a product. And I think to grasp the nub of neoliberalism as a project of the self, and to speak into that space may be a way to usher in debates around the political, the fact that there are lines that cannot be crossed. There is no neutrality. The idea of institutional neutrality is already a value. It's not to be driven. So my last point is I would really value continuing to think with the folks in the room here and starting to rebuild this public consciousness that you've so carefully drawn our attention to. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. I think Nazim is right to point out these are hard-fought gains that we have won in terms of the Constitution. And I agree with you, Rushi. You should be proud of the UCT position, no matter what opposition there is, because it's a different terrain of struggle. You won this resolution. These victories are sometimes provisional. You're going to have to defend them. You're going to have to build trenches around them. What are the strategy and tactics will bring that, right? So this is the language of struggle now, because that's where I come from. You have to constantly struggle to consolidate these victories because they can be unrolled very quickly. And the forces arrayed against us are far more financially powerful than we can imagine, right? I mean, I'm tempted to, but I'm not going to comment on the fact that this institution has a resolution and that the principal officer keeps quiet. Principal officer should be speaking. He's an employee of the council, for heaven's sake. He's the chair of the Senate that has taken a vote on this. I mean, can we put our heads around that? Because in another context, you walk if you do not buy into that resolution. You have to walk. You cannot carry on and imagine you can lead an institution. So that gets to some other questions, very profound questions, about the nature of leadership and so on. But I suppose the point I'm also trying to make, I think we must take an honest look at where we are today. Or what, at one level, and it pains me to say this, of what the ineptitude of the ANC and the liberation movement has brought us to today. Because we shouldn't be having these arguments here at one level. The constitutional imperatives are clear. All our institutions should right now be safe havens and open houses for scholars. And we should be leading the international efforts as a society and as universities. UCT should be in the forefront, coordinating the global efforts. How come it's not happening, despite a beautiful constitution? Despite these beautiful words we have in our mission statements and our vision statements, right, Nazima? What's happening? That's the weaknesses. That's the weaknesses. That, for me, as I said this afternoon, is the organic crisis a la Gramsci. The organic crisis of our universities, which is simultaneously ideological, political, social, and economic. Because the state is defunding our institutions. So we're becoming highly dependent on donors who are proving themselves not just to be of a particular religion, who are proving themselves to be Zionists. That's where the fault lines are being drawn clearly. We need to factor that into our analysis of the current situation and what terrain we are fighting on. Right? So I think you can you can take a position on Gaza, which is a progressive position on Palestine, and not fear necessarily the university is going to collapse and be divided forever. The question is, and it's great, 70%, right, Kelly? But 30%? Exact. So I would be celebrating the 70. I'd be agonizing about the 30, and I would be imploring the 70 to show humanity, love, care, to work on that 30%. And I'm now reminded, and that's where I want to end up, many people, when they write about UWC as the intellectual home, right? And I've had to remind some people who were in this audience before when they've written about it. James Carville did not say intellectual home of the left. He was too smart a scholar. He said intellectual home for the left. A university that aligns it. Now, if it's not off the left, you can't be off the left. Because where's your membership card before you become an academic at you? No. So how do we relate to that 30%, right? To create an environment that we can disagree ideologically, politically. The great scientists who may have the next big great breakthrough that changes the world of medicine, you may not like him ideologically and politically, but I hope there's a home there for that person to do the science that can change humanity's, that's what I agonize about, to be honest, not the victories. It's about those things I agonize about. How do we conduct ourselves on the left with generosity? And not just this triumphalist and vengeful response that these people opposed us. Amongst that 30% are going to be many different kinds of people. People who are absolutely Zionists, right? But you would have to live with them on a campus because this is a university. This is not the Communist Party. I'm serious. We need to think about this. These are universities because we might destroy the university in a different way, where the next thing is going to be orthodox thinking. You're not a Trotskyist, we don't want you here. So it's not the neutrality things I'm worried about. I'm worried about other things, about how we conduct ourselves in the way that when we emerge from this, we are stronger, ideologically, politically, and in many ways. That's why I want to insist, love, care, solidarity. Think about other people in this process and don't claim easy victories. Agonize about these things.
Also, a comment as what we have here is an eco-generational conversation. And what we need to do and constantly do is to bring those different communities into that conversation. It's the only way we learn. We pass the wisdom on and we share the wisdom upwards as well. I'd like to thank Saleem for both engagements today. I know it first because I'm a historian, but I also learned so much more about it today, earlier today. So thank you, Saleem. Thank you, Anna, for the questions and the provocations. Thank you all the colleagues that helped organize this. Hey, thank you, Joseph.